This afternoon we are hosting our first fall event, a panel entitled President Trump and the Middle East. We have here four eminent scholars on this panel, and they will offer stimulating conversation. I'd like to thank our administrative lead, Mary Firdausi, and the AV team for setting everything up, and Jared Milburn for filming the panel. For its generous support, we are grateful to the MSU Symposium in Science, Reason, and Modern Democracy in the Department of Political Science. We would also like to thank our many co-sponsors, including the MSU Asian Studies Center, Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, College of Arts and Letters, College of Social Science, Global Studies in the Arts and Humanities, Honors College, James Madison College, Office for International Students and Scholars, Peace and Justice Studies, and Residential College in the Arts and Humanities. By the way, how's the sound? Are we okay so far? Good. Thank you, Morgan. While I have your attention, I'd like to invite you all to pick up a fall newsletter in the back there. The newsletter lists most of our fall events. We have some interesting events lined up. And before we begin, I should tell you that each panelist will have 10 minutes to speak, and then we'll have discussion and Q&A. We will conclude at 4:45. Now, the way we're going to do this is we're going to begin from, we're going to move from west to east. We're going to begin in Iran, move to Iraq. Sorry, west,
east to west.
East to west. Oh my goodness. Okay, it's been a long summer. East to west. We're going to go east to west. Yes, east to west.
Like the sun.
Like the sun. There you go. So we'll go Iran to Iraq and Syria, and then we'll go south to the Arab Gulf states. Then we'll go to Turkey. And then we'll even hear a little bit about Afghanistan, which is sometimes considered part of the greater Middle East. So, with that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Professor Mohammed Ayoob. Professor Ayoob is University Distinguished Professor Emeritus of International Relations here at Michigan State. He is also the founding coordinator of our unit, the Muslim Studies program. He is a specialist on conflict and security, and has also researched, taught, and published on the intersection of religion and politics in the Muslim world. He has been awarded various prestigious fellowships and research grants, and has authored, co-authored, or edited 15 books, including The Many Faces of Political Islam, and more recently, Will the Middle East Implode? His commentaries on world affairs have been published in The Guardian, Project Syndicate, and on the websites of Foreign Policy, CNN, and others. He currently writes a regular column on international affairs for the National Interest, as well as The Strategist, which is published by Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He will be discussing Iran, and you may have noticed the printout of his article on the back table there. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ayoob.
Thank you, Professor Khalil. I had a little clip
Yes,
there, but
you do.
before can I just use a minute or two of my time before you
Of course.
The clip? This is a clip from the New York Times that I'd like you to see. It sort of sums up what's going on these days in Washington in relation to Iran. But before we do that, I just wanted to make a couple of very brief points about the importance of Iran to American policy. About the importance of Iran to American policy. Can you hear me? No country in the Middle East, I believe, is as important to American foreign policy in that region as Iran, and no issue as critical as U.S.-Iran relations in terms of the nuclear deal that was signed in July 2015. And I say this for a couple of reasons. Iran's importance relates to the fact that it is the preeminent power in the Persian Gulf. The strategically important Persian Gulf because of its energy resources and its geographical location. And secondly, it's one of only two or maybe three states in the Middle East that are really states in the sense of having a state tradition. The others, I would argue, or most of the others, I would argue, are largely tribes with flags. And this has become evident in the last few years as to what is happening in the Fertile Crescent. And finally, it's the only country in the Middle East, other than Turkey, I would have added Egypt, but Egypt has sort of gone down the tube pretty quickly. So it's ruled by what I call a sissy. It's the only country other than Turkey that is committed to preserving its strategic autonomy and act as an independent player in the region. So let's go to the clip.
Sure.
Agreed to confirm that Iran is compliant. In July, President Donald Trump reluctantly agreed to confirm that Iran is complying with the terms of the nuclear agreement. But now analysts say he is actively looking for ways to get the U.S. out of the deal.
The administration has a multi-pronged strategy aimed at pushing Iran to be the first to violate the agreement and therefore get the international blame for it.
Here's how experts say the Trump administration is trying to pull that off. According to several U.S. officials, the administration is trying to force Iran to let the IAEA inspectors onto military sites that are off limits under the deal, but where U.S. intelligence believes Iran might be cheating. Iran would likely resist such inspections, and that would play into Trump's strategy to paint Iran as non-compliant.
I know we're asking to get into various facilities in Iran. If they don't let us in, boom. But what you want is, you want the breakup of this deal to be about Iran. You don't want it to be about the United States, because we want our allies with us.
The Iran deal, which may be the single worst deal I've ever seen drawn by anybody.
In an interview with the Wall Street Journal, President Trump said, "If it was up to me, I would have had them non-compliant 180 days ago." This clearly sets the stage for the U.S. saying Iran isn't in compliance the next time they're asked to recertify in September. In this one brief statement following the G20 meeting, Sarah Huckabee Sanders may have openly admitted that the United States is for the first time not complying with its agreement with Iran and other Western nations.
In his discussions with more than a dozen foreign leaders, he underscored the need for nations to join together to strip terrorists of their funding, territory, and ideological support, and to stop doing business with nations that sponsor terrorism, especially Iran.
The nuclear deal states the U.S. can't pursue a policy that adversely affects the normalization of trade and economic relations with Iran. By openly saying that it may not be abiding by the terms of the nuclear deal, the U.S. could be signaling that they're ready to pull the plug on it. One day after certifying that Iran was complying with the terms of the nuclear deal, the Trump administration announced new Iran-related sanctions on its individuals and companies that the U.S. believes contribute to Iran's exporting of terrorism. These new sanctions create uncertainty in the market and dissuade companies from doing business with Iran. This in turn means that Iran isn't fully reaping the economic benefits of the nuclear deal.
I think it has never been in as much of a danger as it is at the moment, given the fact that it is one issue over which there is almost consensus in Washington that Iran is a bad actor and this agreement is a bad deal.
You may have noticed that one of the things that, what's her name, Sarah Huckabee, the presidential spokesman mentioned was that the United States does not want to encourage, promote whatever relations with countries that promote terrorism, and Iran is the foremost among them. I'm sort of paraphrasing it. This flies, this is an absolute lie, because if there is one country that is opposed to Al-Qaeda, that is opposed to ISIS, it is Iran. And Iran has put in large resources, both in Iraq and Syria, in fighting the ISIS. They don't even understand the difference between what, as a brief shorthand, one would call Sunni jihadism and the Shias. The terrorist threat that the United States faces internationally comes from an ideology that is an ideology of extreme fundamentalism that comes out primarily from Saudi Arabia, the primary Sunni power. And Iran and Saudi Arabia are locked in a Cold War in the Gulf and all over the Middle East. So Iran is actually on the same side as far as international terrorism is concerned as the United States is. So this is how Washington sees the world upside down most of the time, at least as far as it relates to the Middle East. But I just want to take quickly, the problem is that we only have 10 minutes. And if I speak without notes, I can go on for at least 50, having been programmed to do so. So let me stick to my notes as far as possible. The importance of the nuclear deal, which was struck by the Obama administration after a great deal of excruciating negotiations between John Kerry, or even before that, but since John Kerry, in fact, John Kerry was involved in the negotiations even before he became Secretary of State, when Hillary was Secretary of State, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. He was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But he was primarily the mover of the back channel negotiations with Iran, primarily through Oman. And he made several trips to Oman to meet the ruler of Oman, who was passing on messages to Tehran. But when he became the Secretary of State, things really speeded up. But they also speeded up because of the assessment that the CIA made. And Leon Panetta, who was the head of the CIA at that time, made the assessment in January of 2012 that Iran was 12 months away from achieving nuclear weapons capability. This made the United States or Washington really sit up and stand and take notice. And there was a major a major meeting of of relatively low level but important officers from the State Department and the Defense Department on the one hand, and the Iranian Foreign Ministry on the other, in Oman in July of 2012. That set the ball rolling. But nothing really happened until January 2013. And that's very important because the CIA in January 2013 made the assessment that Iran was 8 to 12 weeks away from achieving nuclear weapons capability. So January 2013 is really the crucial date when the Deputy Secretary of State, William Burns, and the Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran, again, this was all very secret, nobody knew about it at that time, met in Oman and started the process that finally led to the JCPOA, as it's called, the joint whatever, the Iranian nuclear deal for short. We should realize that the actual negotiations were not in Vienna. Vienna, the P5+1 negotiations with Iran were really a veneer for what was going on behind the scenes. Much of the discussions and the negotiations were in Oman. Also, when the discussions shifted to Vienna, it was the bilateral discussions between John Kerry and Javad Zarif, his Iranian counterpart, the Iranian foreign minister, that led to the final agreement, which the P5+1, which the P5+1 rubber stamped. The importance of the deal is that had it not been for the Iranian nuclear deal, Iran would have been a nuclear weapons power by now, and that would have had major consequences. Iran, as the CIA estimated in 2013, was 8 to 12 weeks away from the bomb. But the Iranians, the sanctions were also hurting Iran, and Iran wanted a way out of that, but there was a clear priority in Iranian thinking. Sanctions, it's important to get rid of the sanctions, but it was far more important for Iran to preserve its right to enrich uranium, even if that right was granted with certain conditions. And the final Iranian nuclear deal actually hinged on the United States accepting that argument. And that's why the Americans moved from the idea of no enrichment to some enrichment with conditions. This was important for Iran because without it, the government of the Rouhani's government and Javad Zarif would not have got the backing of the supreme leader, who would have then gone over to the other side, back the hardliners, and the entire thing would have collapsed. It would have led to the achievement, of course, of nuclear capability, but would also possibly have led to war, because the United States had made it clear, and particularly with Trump in the White House, that it would not tolerate an Iranian nuclear capability. So the deal that was done after, as I said, these excruciating negotiations with Obama backing Kerry to the hilt was an achievement. Was I think one of the most important post-Cold War achievements of American foreign policy. The Trump administration is now trying to undo much of that for a number of reasons. One, he's obsessed with undoing the Obama legacy. Second, he's also hostage to two lobbies that are viscerally anti-Iranian, the Israeli lobby and the Saudi lobby. The Saudi lobby even more than the Israeli lobby, because if some of you may remember that as far back as 2008, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia had advised the American president to cut off the head of the snake, which meant to invade Iran and decapitate its military capabilities. So there are, and of course, the recent visit by Trump to Riyadh, where he was wined and dined. I don't think he was wined, but maybe in the royal palace you do drink. He was, given such grand treatment that he's become a great admirer of the robed plutocracy in Saudi Arabia. So there are various forces at work that are trying to undermine, and of course the Republican Congress was never particularly pleased with the nuclear deal. Now the certification issue is not a part of the deal. It was not written into the deal that the U.S. Congress should certify it. It was a deal between the P5+1 and Iran, and there were certain conditions laid down which Iran has met. The IAEA has repeatedly certified that it has. But this was an act passed by Congress that the president must report every 90 days to the Congress, certifying that Iran is in compliance with the deal. The last two times since Trump has been president, he has done so very, very reluctantly. And he's made clear that he's not going to do it in October. And come October, if he refuses to certify, it will be for the Congress to decide whether to reimpose sanctions in Iran or not. Given the composition of the Congress, it looks like it will reimpose sanctions, though some of the Republican senators and congressmen have had second thoughts about it. But if I'll just take 1 moment. If the sanctions are reimposed, there could be two outcomes. One, the other P5 would continue to maintain their obligations, and Iran could deal with them. Some of the sanctions would be lifted, and economic transactions could take place. And that would mean that the United States would be isolated on the issue. Even its closest European allies aren't willing to go along with the United States. But that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that the hardliners in Tehran will then say we were right. The Americans were never interested in having this deal. We let Rouhani and Javad Zarif. We gave them some slack so that they could demonstrate that they would be able to achieve something or not. They are not able to achieve anything. So let's go back to enriching uranium and making the bomb, and also go down the plutonium route through the heavy water plant in Iraq. And that would lead to a race to build the bomb, or a number of bombs, or whatever. And that could mean anything. I mean, that could really mean catastrophe. So we are at a very historic moment when one wrong, or should we say in ideological terms, one right move could lead to a major conflagration in the Middle East, which would look like the Iraqi and Syrian episodes, child's play. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ayoob. Our next presenter is Professor Juan Kuhl. Professor Kuhl is Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. For 3 decades, he has sought to put the relationship of the West and the Muslim world in historical context. His works include The New Arabs, Engaging the Muslim World, and Napoleon's Egypt, Invading the Middle East. He has been a regular guest on PBS's Lehrer NewsHour and has also appeared on ABC Nightly News, Nightline, The Today Show, Charlie Rose, Anderson Cooper 360, Rachel Maddow, The Colbert Report, and many others. And we are extremely grateful to him for making a 4th visit to Michigan State in 4 years. Professor Kuhl will be discussing Iraq and Syria. So please join me in welcoming Professor Juan Kuhl.
So my charge is can you everybody hear me? Is this working?
Yeah, this down.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, maybe I should just stand.
That's all. That's all.
My charge is to try to explain Trump's policy towards Syria and Iraq. Explaining Trump's policies is not a straightforward endeavor. We policy analysts have been used to dealing with people like George H.W. Bush, who had been the director of the CIA and ambassador to China, and who had policies. I mean, he might change his mind about the policy, but he had a philosophy out of which the policy would derive. So it's like an ornithologist that's been used to studying geese that go in a certain direction together. And now we have a hummingbird, which might show up anywhere, anytime, at any plant. And it's very difficult to analyze where this person is going. Let me do my best. With regard to Syria, the Syria crisis began as a youth revolution like the other youth revolutions of 2011. But the Syrian regime, dastardly and clever as it is, figured out a way to turn it into a war on terror and a civil war. So those young people who came out and said, we'd like to be able to have a Saturday Night Live kind of spoof of the president, who said, we want more civil liberties, who said, we'd like to open up the school curriculum at our college. The regime just pulled up tanks and artillery and fired shells at them and killed them and their friends. And after a while, those youth picked up a gun. And then it turned into civil war. And after a while, when it turned into civil war, if you're a fighter in the field, you're fighting a powerful and well-equipped Syrian Arab army, you're looking around for allies. And you would go to France, and France is not interested in getting involved. And you would go to the UK and the United States, not very interested in getting involved. And Obama had come in on a pledge not to be entangled in the Middle East. And so initially, at least, until I would say about 2013, Obama had a relatively hands-off policy towards Syria. And so if you were in the field and fighting and needing weapons and ammunition and some kind of support, where would you go? Well, Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Kuwait and the Gulf monarchies, many of them extremely religiously conservative, belonging to the Wahhabi branch of Islam in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, were the ones who were willing to try to smuggle in money and arms. And so the price of continuing the fight against the Syrian regime was to become, at least in appearance, a fundamentalist. And people in the field have talked about how they saw their friends going from French-style liberals to Saudi-style extremists under the influence of this money. But then, of course, what the al-Assad regime in Syria could do is go to the world community and say, well, we're fighting al-Qaeda. Why aren't you stepping up? Al-Qaeda is hitting you in Paris and Brussels. And then al-Qaeda split and half of it became ISIL. And ISIL was hitting them in Paris and Brussels. And the Western powers began to, rethink this thing, that maybe it's not a good idea to have those sorts of people sweep in and take over Damascus and then have a whole country from which they could pursue their agenda against the West. At the same time, Vladimir Putin was looking out at Syria and seeing the thing go in this direction and decided that, well, this would just be a very large and dangerous Chechnya. And Putin had made his bones by crushing the Chechens when they did their second revolt in the early 2000s. He crushed it by 2002. The second revolt in Chechnya was also very much entangled in religious nationalism, unlike the first Chechen revolt in the 90s against Yeltsin. So Putin has a long track history of seeing extremist Muslim movements as a threat to Moscow. 15% of the Russian population, of the Russian Federation, is Muslim, and so were this ideology to spread in Russia, this would be a major issue for the country. And then you have had problems in the Caucasus, not only inside the Russian Federation but on its borders. And so Putin decided this won't be allowed. Iran also went to Moscow and said, look, we've done all we could. We put in some money. We brought in Hezbollah, but it's not enough. So if you don't want Damascus to fall to the opposition, which is largely Sunni groups allied with the conservative Gulf, then you're going to have to do something. So the Russians went in, and the Russians bombed the bejesus out of Syria. They intensively bombed cities, neighborhoods, without any concern for loss of civilian life, a disproportionate use of force, and they also bumped up the capacity of the regime to do so. So the Obama administration from 2013, and before the Russians went in 2015, had turned and begun deciding to put some money, it said $1 billion, into the opposition. And there was a lot of dissent inside Washington because some people said, why are we giving Al-Qaeda $1 billion? Because some of the groups in Syria were Al-Qaeda affiliates, and some of this money and arms is going to them. So when Trump came in, that was the situation, is that Russia had come in, the opposition had gone extremist. So what Trump has done is to say, well, if Putin wants to handle Syria, let him handle it. So unlike the Obama administration, which was uncomfortable with Syria becoming a Russian sphere of influence, and it had been in the old days a Soviet one, Trump is perfectly all right with that. And this drives, of course, the neoconservatives and the more hawkish elements in Washington completely up the wall. Trump has, however, also continued the Obama era policy of having the United States give military support, including about 1,000 embedded special operations forces, to left-wing Syrian Kurds to fight ISIL. And as we speak, the left-wing Syrian Kurds are in control of about half of Raqqa, which is the ISIL capital, and it's likely that Raqqa will fall to them fairly soon. So that policy of Obama has been successful on the ground as a military policy in rolling up ISIL. However, it drives Turkey absolutely crazy because Turkey is afraid that those Syrian Kurds will blow back on Kurdish subnationalism in Turkey itself. Kurds are 20% of Turkey and so forth. Relations with Turkey are roiled. Relations, although Trump gets along with Saudi Arabia and so forth, basically he's sided against Saudi Arabia in Syria, and the Saudis, I think, are deciding that just going to have to swallow that. With regard to Iraq, Trump has more or less continued the Obama policy, which was to give air support to the Iraqi army, to build back up the Iraqi army, and behind the scenes, and without being willing to say so, to give air support also to the Iran-backed militias of Shiite militias of Iraq, who have been the more effective fighting forces in rolling up ISIL. ISIL has lost almost everything in Iraq by now. Some of that was done by the rebuilt Iraqi army, their 3 brigades of the counterterrorism force, but a good deal of the heavy lifting was done by Shiite militias, who are deeply entwined with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. This is why Professor Ayoob says when Washington stands up and denounces Iran as major source of terrorism in the world. Well, it's those Shiite militias in part that it's talking about, but the hypocrisy is the United States is supporting them militarily without being willing to say so. So that Obama policy in Iraq succeeded. It succeeded over 3 years, and so it made a lot of people impatient. But it has more or less been continued by Secretary of Defense James Mattis, who had been in Iraq as an officer himself, and H.R. McMaster, who is the National Security Advisor, who also had, led the invasion of Tel Afar in the Iraq War. And so these people are now presiding over the second conquest of these Sunni Arab areas. Trump did send did send 59 cruise missiles onto a Syrian base, which was alleged to have used chemical weapons, but that was a one-off. In every other way, he's basically given Syria away to Russia, and without saying so or being willing to come out about it, the U.S. policy is that they're fine with Iraq being closely allied with Iran as long as it crushes ISIL. So there's a lot of hypocrisy about this. There's a lot of erratic behavior. Some parts of the administration speak with a different voice than other parts. But if one keeps one's eye on that hummingbird, Trump, the main outlines are there, that Syria is now a Russian sphere of influence as long as it helps to crush the extremists, and the Sunni extremists have been crushed with the help of Iran and Iraq. And that's where we stand now. And unfortunately, this set of policies are contradictory and also produce a Shiite-dominated Iraq with a very large Sunni minority. That's not a stable situation. The reinstitution of the al-Assad regime, which is a horrible totalitarian regime in Syria by the Russians, is probably also not a stable situation. So my guess is they have to do it all over again in about 10 years.
Thank you, Professor Kuhl. Our next presenter is Professor Russell Lucas. He is an associate professor in James Madison College and the College of Arts and Letters, and is the director of global studies in the arts and humanities. His research specializes on Middle Eastern politics and culture with attention to foreign policy, public opinion, political institutions, and the media. His book, Institutions and the Politics of Survival in Jordan, Domestic Responses to External Challenges, 1988 to 2001, was published by Sunny Press. He has also published articles in a range of major journals. His current research focuses on conceptions of public opinion in the Arab world and on the politics of Arab monarchies. This afternoon, he will be discussing the Arab Gulf states. So please join me in welcoming Professor Russell Lucas.
Thank you. How is that? A little better now? Good? Okay. Okay. All right. All right. I've been asked to talk about Donald Trump in the Middle East in relation initially to Saudi Arabia, but I think recent events have shown us that there's more than just Saudi Arabia among the Arab Gulf states. And on President Trump's watch, the now Gulf Cooperation Council is no longer missing, or is now missing its cooperation. And so one of the things I think we do have to take a step back, and I think Professor Cole really summed it well with a bird metaphor in terms of the Trump's presidency. We have to remember that this is not normal foreign policy. I think we just need to keep that in mind, that the Arab Gulf states and a lot of other states are reacting to kind of a profound leadership vacuum in the United States and increasingly in the world that the United States had been filling. Now, previously, different American administrations could emphasize, the use of American power or the use of American diplomatic engagement or even just paying attention. They could promote American values and its version of morality on the international sphere. And the recent administrations pick and chose from this list in different ways, had profoundly different policies for doing that. What we see now is that really none of these are being emphasized. Power without engagement and even just kind of throwing a few cruise missiles and then doing nothing isn't really power anymore. Engagement is not showing up, receiving $500,000 worth of gifts and then leaving. Morality is not conducted in 140 characters at a time. Now, of course, for those of us who pay attention to foreign policy, we're always reliant on, don't worry, Donald Trump is president, but there's, and he can do what he wants. There's a lot of adults in the room. And so therefore, we should not worry because the Secretary of State's an oil man. He can take care of the Middle East. But, our former Exxon chairman is kind of absent, and the State Department is shrinking as we watch. Our former generals in the Department of Defense, in the National Security Council, the Chief of Staff, have not taken Twitter away. And so what are the adults actually doing? And so one of the questions that I think when we're looking at the Arab Gulf states and what they're thinking, one of the questions that kind of pops up is, and I think this is something that we can be asking too, is there no policy? Is it a bad policy? And the question is which is worse, no policy or just a bad policy? And I think this is where a lot of the Arab Gulf states have taken to reacting to, is that they don't see that there is a policy, or if there is a policy, it's been a bad policy. Now, in all fairness, a lot of the Arab Gulf states have been saying that even before Donald Trump was president, and we're saying that under the Obama administration, that America was pulling back from the Gulf. It was ignoring its long-standing allies of the Arab Gulf states. And that by making deals with Iran, this was working against especially Saudi interests, but some of the other Gulf states agreed, other Gulf states may not so much. And so one of the things that we can see is that the Obama administration seemed to tip in the direction of Iran against the Arab Gulf states, despite all the real indicators that the Obama administration was not doing so. This led, especially to Saudi Arabia, to kind of abandon its long-standing traditions of how it conducted foreign policy. Traditionally, Saudi Arabia was a very quiet regional power. It would stand behind the scenes, funnel money to its chosen causes, use its connections for diplomacy, and let other people do the fighting. Over the past few years, Saudi Arabia has begun to abandon that. And this is stemming from a Saudi sense of insecurity. That Iran seems to be empowered. As Professor Cole just pointed out, that actually that it seems to be even being aided by the United States. And it also has a very strong domestic root in a generational change in Saudi politics. The leaders of Saudi Arabia since the 1950s have been all of one generation, and that generation is now about to pass on power to the grandsons of Saudi Arabia's founder. And so the new crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, has been rising in power over the past few years, and has announced his triumph in family politics in a new stamp of Saudi foreign policy that's characterized by Saudi Arabia doing things very differently than it had been. And one of them is actually not letting other people do the fighting, but actually Saudi Arabia getting itself involved in Yemen, fighting Iran through a proxy war, but also fighting local Yemeni groups that are opposed to Saudi Arabia. And I think probably the most notable example of Saudi Arabia changing its foreign policy is kind of the most recent events that happened just after President Trump visited Saudi Arabia for a conference on terrorism. And that was that Saudi Arabia decided to not just kind of use the United States to help further its aims in fighting Iran, but also to try to help Saudi Arabia put some order into its own local allies in terms of developing a boycott of Qatar. Now, often we kind of think of Saudi Arabia and the other Arab Gulf states as kind of, a lump of different regimes that look exactly like each other, behave exactly like each other. And yeah, they tend to have the same economic base. They tend to have similar structures of government. But on the other hand, what those families have been doing with those governments and what they have been doing with the petroleum revenue that they have, and some of them have a lot more than others, has been really different over the past few years. And so of the 6 Arab Gulf states in the Gulf Cooperation Council, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Kuwait, and Bahrain, each of these governments has kind of gone a little bit in its own direction. And Saudi Arabia, over the past few years, has been trying to pull these different states back into its control. And so, with the Qatar boycott, we can see that Saudi Arabia is really trying to push Qatar to follow the Saudi line. The United Arab Emirates has followed, and it also has followed well in Yemen. On the other hand, Kuwait and Oman haven't necessarily followed so much. And so we may be seeing the potential even end of the Gulf Cooperation Council, a real rift within these Gulf states. And this is coming partly out of a lack of U.S. foreign policy, that there is seemingly no policy going on. But hold it, wait. There are some theories on this. One of them is that the United States has backed Saudi Arabia in the boycott of Qatar. Well, okay, seemingly it has. Although just yesterday, President Trump was supporting Kuwaiti diplomatic efforts. But initially, President Trump was quite supportive of the Saudi boycott. Now, one of the reasons that has popped up for that is that in Trump Tower in New York, Saudi Arabia has leased space, the United Arab Emirates has leased space, but Qatar Airlines declined to lease space. And so therefore, Qatar deserves to be pushed aside. Now, I don't believe that. But the fact that we're actually having this conversation today is really troublesome. This is not normal. And so we have to keep that in mind as we're looking at what's going on. And so is no policy worse than a bad policy? So, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lucas. Last but certainly not least is Professor Martha Olcott. Professor Olcott is visiting professor at James Madison College at MSU and professor emerita at Colgate University. She's the author of numerous books and articles, including most recently Kazakhstan Unfulfilled Promise, In the Whirlwind of Jihad, and Tajikistan's Difficult Development Path. For many years, Professor Olcott was a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and has served as an advisor to the U.S. government, to international institutions, and to international businesses. She will be discussing Turkey. We'll also say a word on Afghanistan. Please join me in welcoming Professor Olcott.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to actually divide my time pretty evenly between Turkey and Afghanistan for 2 reasons. Just let me start the slides because I can't do two things at once. Sorry. Having come from having spent 20 years in Washington, 19 and change, I suppose I'm not sure there have been adults in the room for at least many of my years in Washington. So, or how good a job the adults did. I mean, I'll grant that they were adults. I do grant that we're in a different situation now under Trump. One of the reasons I wanted to take Afghanistan as well as Turkey is that this is a place where Trump has actually made policy decisions. Good or bad, he has made a decision to send troops in, more troops, although we don't know how many. And also I feel that it's obvious why we would consider Turkey, but I do think since 2001, policymakers have linked Afghanistan and the Middle East, and there have been playoffs between the two, between the degree to which America can be committed in Iraq based on their commitments in Afghanistan and vice versa. So I really think that Afghanistan belongs in a discussion because the degree to which the U.S. is engaged in Afghanistan is almost de facto going to shape what kinds of policies we may be able to pursue in the Middle East. In terms of U.S.-Turkish relations, I'm not sure that U.S.-Turkish relations are worse because Trump is there. I think that U.S.-Turkish relations, I'm trying to think how to put it, that they're now moving in a direction, and they have been as a result of Erdogan's policy choices and his strengthening the presidency and moving against what the U.S. sees as a basic human rights focused regime. So the U.S. policy would be strained vis-a-vis Turkey with or without Trump. The strains we get because of Trump are different strains potentially than we might have gotten before Trump. Like so many other areas, Turkey is a place Erdogan expected more of Trump because at the time of the coup, Trump thought that Erdogan had behaved appropriately. And so there was this expectation that he would treat Turkey better. When the decision was made to continue the sale of arms to Kurds in Syria, that proved to be a very disturbing event for him. And ever since, I mean, the meeting in May, again, the meeting in May between the two presidents was itself very stressful from the point of view of both sides, given that security guards beat up demonstrators in front of the Turkish embassy, and that created a policy problem that the White House had very little choice in how to engage. And the fact that several of these bodyguards have now been indicted in Washington is a continual strain. At the same time, and this was just yesterday, I think, or the day before yesterday, there were indictments in New York. Federal indictments came down against several Turks, including a former minister of economics, if I recall correctly, or minister of finance, for violating Iran sanctions for allegedly money laundering for the business interests in Iran. So again, these things strain the U.S. relationship. I would argue, though, that the U.S. and Turkey is talking about needing to find new partners. I would argue that this conversation would be there regardless. That doesn't mean that President Trump has pursued a clear, straightforward policy with Turkey. But I think Erdogan's priorities put him in a place that would create potential tensions with the U.S. regardless. The Turkish-Russian relationship has again become much closer, having been strained with a shooting down of a plane in 2015. And there's a chance if the U.S. doesn't go forward with a major arms sales plan for 2018, that Russian arms, that Russia may sell, I don't know if the same generation of arms, but may come in as a major arms supplier. All this has real consequence for NATO. And finally, with Turkey, I'd like to say that Turkish-Iranian relations are one that sit uncomfortably in Washington. And I think they would sit uncomfortably even in a Democratic administration. Turkish-Iranian relations have gotten closer, in part because of the situations in Syria. And again, I think that what we see is a much more assertive Turkey, and if you like, a much more confused U.S. But the assertiveness of Turkey is not predicated on the confusions of Washington. I think it's predicated on Erdogan's own view of Turkey and where he wants it to go. I want to talk about the decision about Afghanistan very, very briefly, because I'm running short of time. I want to show a bunch of maps of Afghanistan, because here I think the decision that the Trump administration has taken to increase the amount of U.S. troops there without telling us how many they're sending in is a decision that he felt really pressed to. I'm not sure that it will have the effect that the administration wants, but clearly the situation in Afghanistan was not improving. The government of Afghanistan is not either unified or in control of their own territory. It's very hard to know what control is. That's why I had this quote, which you've had lots of opportunity to read now. So I think what is important to stress is that the national government can't control the territory of the country, and pro-Taliban forces have a capacity to not create traditional governments in the areas they dominate, but to assert their domination through both militarily and through the creation of mobile Sharia courts, and just through, as I'll have it with the very last slide, through attacking government forces or pro-government forces. It's very hard. Everybody's standards of who's in control of what vary, but what you're going to see is a pattern in which over the past 10 years there has been very little increase in the amount of territory controlled long-term. By controlled, I mean where the government of Afghanistan is able to guarantee the human security of the people living in a region. In 2007 and 2008, and all the maps are sourced, and different authors put the same territory at the same time in different hands, so that makes it kind of hard. But as we'll see in 2007 and 2008, and the green dots are insurgent attacks, and the blue dots are NATO offensives, resulting in deaths. What you see in 2007 and 2008 is a country in which the Taliban had a very strong presence in the south and a presence in the north as well. And this explains part of the refocusing that Obama did, and the agreement to send in the 30,000 additional troops. And the troops were sent to train mostly in the areas that were overwhelming to areas dominated by Taliban. I only have like 2 more or 3 more maps. We see as a result in 2010 there's some improvement in the situation, with improvement being defined as moderately insecure and deteriorating and low insecurity rather than extremely insecure and highly insecure. By 2015, again, and you'll see again in 2016, 2017, you have areas already, 2 different versions of Taliban's reach. You see by this period in time, as troops are being withdrawn, that Taliban's reach is expands through 2016. Again, the sources have the picture somewhat different. This is the situation in 2017, where already you have areas that are both Taliban controlled and contested and no longer in the control of the government. Again, this is 2017, the New York Times. August 1st shows it slightly worse. And this is my very last slide. This is from January to June 2016, the number of terrorist and counter-terrorist incidents in Afghanistan, and it gives you some idea of what a joy it would be to be living in Afghanistan, how just terrifying the lack of personal security really is. with the lightest pink being only 1 to 10 incidents, and where it's black, 101 to 135 incidents in the course of 6 months. So this is the situation of insecurity that President Trump has decided to intervene again in. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Olcott. Okay.